What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. So today's video is gonna kind of be all over the place. This is me kind of just throwing out the rest of the footage that I had that didn't get lost in my memory card fiasco. If you haven't heard about that, I addressed it a couple videos back. But there was a whole bunch of footage that was decent that I didn't want to just throw away, you know. So it's me addressing setting up the rear links and some coilovers and a little bit of the front links and stuff. So if it seems a little, you know, unorganized and all over the place, forgive me for that. There's lots of footage missing that I did film and explain things, but I don't know. If you're interested to see kind of how my brain works when I'm building stuff, feel free to watch.
Oh my god, dude, it did not let up.
Alright, so I'm currently getting the rear axle positioned where I want it. It's not totally center right now, this tire's sticking out more than the other side, but it is pretty much where I want it front to back position, so it might go forward a little more, but my main goal was I wanted the back tires just barely past the rear bumper. And then obviously I'll have to trim these to fit. Another thing that I had to trim, I've done it on the other side already, but I haven't done it on this side, is this big chunk right here. So the tail light goes right here. Let me grab it, I'll show you. Alright, so the tail light goes here, and I've always had this big ugly box underneath it that I've wanted to get rid of for a long time. You know, usually the stock bumper, usually the stock bumper runs right underneath this and covers it up, but once I did my nice bumper, I just had this big box here, and I would have just cut it out, but the problem is my roll cage goes right to there, right? So if I come on the inside here, you can see the cage comes down to a plate right here, which is literally the only reason I haven't cut that out yet. So on the other side, I've already gone ahead and addressed this. I cut the cage right here, and then I just cut that whole corner out. So you can see this big chunk right here. This was right, the floorboard in here, as well as that big box here. And getting rid of that's going to do two things. One, it's going to clean up the underside of the tail light. I still have this back side of the tub. I got to remove this whole plate here and then rebuild the tub and the floorboard, obviously. And so that'll get rid of this here. But so it cleans this up, but it also is going to give me lots of room for travel for the tire, lots of room for the shock and stuff. And you're going to get a nice good look at the axle and everything. So I think it's going to look way better once I'm done. I gotta do the other side still. And then once we have that in there, I'm going to put both the tires on, get the axle where I want it, measure and center it, and then start mocking up some links. So that is the goal. Alright, the cage is cut. I did measure to try and at least match that side. Got the bottom plate out as well. I just cut the tube off right where it meets the frame. I'll come back later and grind that smooth. So the next thing is to get an angle grinder with a cutoff wheel and cut along the bottom of the tail light. I don't even need to mark it out. I can like visually see where the tail light ends. And then on this side, I'm going to come and cut right along the bottom of this fender line here. And then there is 2 layers to this stuff. So I got to come back on the inside and do the same line on the inside here, and then up along the floorboard. And then I'll have matching giant holes in the floor. Yay. Alright, I may have gotten a little carried away, but I think it's the right way to do it. Like I said, I hadn't cut this part out yet on this side, and so I just went ahead and did it on this side. give the tire as much room as it's going to need on the inside, and then I'll rebuild the tub around the roll cage. So my current, I don't have a set in stone plan for the roll cage yet. Obviously I have to do something with this. This isn't safe. My current thought is to weld a little stud right here and then run a piece up to it like that, and then chop it off wherever it needs to be. I'm not totally set on that. I might have a piece bent with a little S bend in it and then weld it to this and sleeve it right there as well. I'm not totally sure what I'm gonna do yet, but for sure it needs to be addressed. But one thing I am really happy with is the fact that I don't have those ugly boxes anymore underneath the taillights. I think that's going to look way better. Obviously I need to trim the fender more, and this wheel's not actually on there, so it looks a lot wider than it really is, but looking pretty good. It's going to be awesome to be able to see the coilover and everything that far up. It's going to look so good. So now that I have the axle sitting under the Jeep where I want it stretch wise, you know, I've lined the tire and wheel up. I even mounted it and I made sure that it was where I wanted it in the wheel well. I have the axle basically at full bump. Like, I don't have my bump stops installed, but you can see, I mean, if I go up much higher, it's going to be hitting the frame. And my shock is hanging by some zip ties, and you can see it's basically at bump as well. So the next thing I need to do is I need to measure wheel mount to wheel mount surface, find the exact center of this axle, and then I need to mark it on the truss somewhere so I know where the center point is. And then I need to position the axle exactly center within the framework, exactly center within the frame rails. So that way we can start mocking up our upper links. For the mocking of the links, I just went to Lowe's or Home Depot and bought some 2-inch PVC tube. I also got some 1 3/4. This is the 1 3/4 one for the uppers, because I'm going to be running some smaller links on the rear uppers just for clearance. The reason for that is these are so much cheaper than tube, right? This much Dom tube would cost me $400 to $500, and this much PVC was like $10. And so if I cut one of these up and I don't like the way it cycles, I can just throw it away and go back and buy more until I get it to cycle and clear it correctly. And it's much, much cheaper and way less scary than using it with Dom, because if you cut Dom, if you cut the steel tube and it's not right, you know, you have to sleeve it or buy more, and that's not fun. Alright, so I'm just plugging away here. I'm not filming the entire process, but I'll give you an update every now and then. So I did measure wheel mount to wheel mount, and I found center. And I have center marked right here, as well as all the way across the top of the truss. Then I took a square and I just lined the square up right down middle. And then I was able to measure from there to the inside of the frame rail on both sides to get the axle centered. That was the best way I found, just because I didn't, with my frame plates and stuff that I've done, it was hard to find something consistent on both sides to measure where it needed to be. So that's what I ended up doing, and it looks dead nuts if I back up and look at it. So I think that's good. Then the next thing that I did, was actually get one of the links tacked in here. So what I did for that was I just bolted the heims on both sides up. I kind of eyeballed where I wanted this bracket, and then I used a tape measure to simulate the link, you know, and I kind of looked at clearance wise up against the frame, and I mainly looked at the position of the heim, because I didn't want the heims to be super maxed out either way, right? And I actually tacked this bracket on, and then I ended up cutting it off and moving it in a little bit more because the frame side heim was pretty maxed out. And so I scooted it in about 3/4 of an inch or so, and that gave that heim pretty much straight, and this one's pretty straight, not bad at all. These brackets are cool because they if you look at them, they're not perfectly straight, right? And so when you buy these brackets from Barnes, they give you an option as to how much of a degree you want them to bend. And so I don't remember exactly what my degree was, but they're both bent in a little bit, and so you can do a little bit of triangulation on the lower links as well, which is nice. And so that also helps with not maxing the heims out. So after I had those in, then I went and I cut a piece of PVC and stuck it on there, and that gives you a really good idea of what the link looks like. And also it allows me to set my upper link mount on here, and I was able to measure the link separation at the axle. So link separation at the axle is important because the closer that the links are together, the more leverage the links have on the brackets, right? And so if they're closer together, you're going to have a lot higher chance of ripping a bracket off. Whereas if the farther apart you give them, the stronger basically the joints are going to be. And so a good rule of thumb is if you're going big tires, you know, 40s or around there, 10 inches or more of separation at the axle side. At the frame side, it's not as important. You can plug all of these numbers into a 4-link calculator, and it'll really help you dial in your anti-dive and anti-squat numbers and stuff if you care about that stuff, which I might of this go around. I didn't really do it on the rear end of the last go around. I did on the front, but it's not as critical if it's just a rock crawler. If you're building like an Ultra 4 truck or something, obviously you need to do that. But for a rock crawler, it's not that important. Just get the links strong, make sure they cycle and clear, make sure there's enough triangulation so that the axle doesn't move on you, and then just cycle. That's the number one thing, is cycle it to bump, cycle it to droop, cycle it to flex, cycle it to the other flex, with the tires on, with the tires off, with the shocks on, you know, do it all. And make sure that everything clears, because there's always something that rubs somewhere. On my last setup, you can see the tire actually rubbed on my dual rate isolators here, and you know, there's just some things that you can't fix. But with the full width axle, it should be a lot easier. There's a lot more room to work with. On the next step for me is going to be trying to copy this exactly on the other side. And I'm going to do that before I mess with the upper links. And so I didn't really take any measurements here when I welded this on. I just kind of held it up where I thought I liked the heims and tacked it on. And so the way that I'm going to copy that on the other side is by measuring the distance between here and the brake flange, and the distance between here and the truss. That'll give me my up and down, and this will give me my side to side, and then it'll give me a rough idea of where the other one needs to be on the other side. So I'll go do that now, and then build a lower link for the other side and get it bolted on, and then we can start mocking up our uppers. So I got both the lower links tacked on, and as I backed up and looked at it a little more, I don't like how low hanging this is. It's probably okay, but it could definitely be a lot higher. So I think I'm going to cut those tacks off and then rotate that up a little more, just to get a little extra ground clearance here, because I had like 12 inches of link separation, so I've got quite a bit of wiggle room there. I can push this up to where it's almost flat, shorten the links a little bit. They'll be stronger that way anyways. Yeah, so that's lesson number one of why you don't fully weld any of this stuff out until you are positive it's where you want it to go. You're going to cut the tacks off and move them a whole bunch of times. Oh yeah, I like that way more. So I just moved it up like maybe an inch. It's still got plenty of link separation, but you can see how much more ground clearance it has than that one. A lot better. That one would get hung up on rocks all day. Alright, so after I got both the lower link mounts moved up how I wanted them, I went ahead and re-held up the link. Obviously it was too long, so I had to cut off that much, not a ton. And then it fit right back up again. So that's good. I'm liking the way it looks. So to copy the other side, I know that the lower link on the axle is the same, and I trust that the upper link on the frame is the same because I welded that in myself, so I'm pretty sure I measured those back then. So all I need to do is measure exactly how long this tube is, and that's what I've already done. Went ahead and made a second one for the other side, and that should position the axle nice and straight. What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. So the Jeep has made a ton of progress since you guys last saw it. The axle is sitting under there. I have the links all tacked up. I've already cycled the suspension a whole bunch. You can see I've got my new shock hoops welded in and tied into the roll cage. I really like how this came out. It's looking good. There's still a few more tubes that I want to add. I have to do the same thing on this side. I only have the shock hoop in. But I'm getting real anxious that I want to set the tires on it and get the coilovers mounted up. So today we are going to be working on getting the coilovers mounted, and I'm going to show you guys how to properly do that and how to properly calculate the spring rates so you can order the new ones and make sure that you get it all right. So the first step before you even get to the coilovers is obviously getting the links mounted up. I didn't film that, although I wish I would have now that I'm doing this video, and I've had a couple people already ask me about it. The main thing you want to do is make sure it's the same on both sides, and then you want to cycle the suspension. And what that means is you want to push the axle all the way to bump, and then all the way to droop, and then you want to leave one side on the ground, and you want to flex the other side all the way to bump, and do the same thing, flex this side all the way to bump, and look at all the heims and the link clearances and everything when you're doing that. You want to make sure that nothing is binding, nothing is hitting anywhere it shouldn't be. Like, for example, my upper links, where are they at? My upper links right here, they hit the floor pan way up there where they mount at full bump. And it, you know, if it hit much worse than it does now, I would have to address that because I don't want these links to bend. But right now it's just barely touching them, and that's past the bump stops. So I think it's gonna be okay. I still might take the upper links off and beat the floor pan up with a hammer a little bit right there where it's hitting. But stuff like that, you wanna make sure that your lowers don't hit the frame. You wanna make sure your tires don't hit the links. You wanna make sure your tires don't hit the shock. But yeah, so there's lots of stuff that you want to take into account. But once you know that the axle cycles and flexes all good, the next thing you're going to do is push the axle all the way to bump, okay? Not like kind of to bump, not close to bump, all the way. Stuff that thing up in there, okay? Now the next step is you're going to get your coilover. This same process would go if you had an air shock or something too, okay? But you're going to take it and you're going to let all of the nitrogen out. That will allow you to push the shaft all the way up. You can see I actually need to let a little bit more out of mine because there's something I can't push it all the way up. And then when it comes to a coilover, you're going to want to take the upper spring off. I like to leave one on. That way I can still check the tire clearances on it. I need to go through and take this coil separator off. So once you have the nitrogen completely drained out of the shock, you're going to want to push the shock all the way to bump. And then I use a zip tie to just kind of hang it from the shock hoop. That allows me to slide it around and stuff. And you can set the shock up on the axle and kind of get an idea of how it's going to look, where it's going to go. All right, so shock tabs. So when it comes to shock tabs, I only run 1/4 inch plate. I know some people do it on thinner plate, and I do not. I don't trust it. I don't even hardly trust just these on 1/4 inch. I think I might even, once I get the shocks mounted, run some flat bar across to tie them together. You don't want these to break off. You want to be able to weld it all the way around on both tabs. So one other trick is, obviously we're gonna take these two tabs, we're gonna put the shock in between them, and we're gonna bolt it down nice and tight so we know that it's the right distance. But when you weld stuff, they have a tendency to push together, you know, as the weld cools. So a trick is to put a washer inside of that, so that way when you put the washer inside and then your shock and then the other tab, that way when you weld it and it cools and you take everything apart, that washer will give you enough room that you can still easily take the shock in and out without it being a major pain. So like I said, you want to make sure that you get this tight. Doesn't have to be like wicked tight, but you want it, you know, snug, so you know it's the right distance. Don't get it so tight that you can't move the tabs though, because you still want to be able to move these around to fit to the tube better. So as I'm slowly setting this up here, one thing is I'm not really considering the reservoir right now. I don't want to worry about that. I will figure the reservoir out. The main thing that I'm focusing on is making sure that the shock clears the frame and the tire. And so right now, obviously it looks like the tire would clear by a mile, right? It's way out here. But what you have to consider is when the passenger or the other side fully droops, right? Say this was flexed out on a rock, the tire is going to be way up here like this, and when you're running a big tire, it'll have a tendency to get into the coilover, and you don't really want that. If it's into it really bad and you don't have a sway bar, and say you're turning at high speed, you're going to feel the lugs going thud 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 on the side of the coilover. You don't want that. It's going to chew the paint all up on the nice shock. And so you just don't want that. You want to make sure that it doesn't bind on anything, especially the frame. You know, the tire at least is rubber and gives a little bit. The frame is not. That's going to be really bad. So that's the main thing that I'm looking at right now. Obviously I don't have the lower shock mounts on or anything because I'm going to cut those to fit wherever I want it to sit. And then as far as these tabs go, you know, if I need to grind these down to fit a different way, I will. And I actually might do that. Right now they're sticking, it's causing the shock eye to stick further over than I want it to, so I'd like the shock to be a little closer to this tube. So I might take these off and re-grind them down a little bit. Not sure yet. We'll find out. And like I was saying, the reason I left the coil on, because obviously the coil is just sitting in there, it's not doing any good, but it allows me to bring the shock, this one's at full bump, so it's kind of hard to explain, but once I get this mounted, right, say I droop the axle down, I can slide this coil up and down the entire length of the shock, all throughout its travel, and make sure that it doesn't hit on anything, the tire, the frame, anything like that, at any point in the travel. And so that's why I like to leave one on, so you can do that. All right, so I'm wanting to grind this shock tab down to move the eye in a little bit, basically. And obviously I could sit there with a grinder and try and match it perfectly. But what I'm gonna do instead is I've got a piece of 1 3/4 tube, which is the same size tube that we're trying to go to. And I'm just gonna lay it on there wherever I want the eye at, right? So right now it's way over here. I want it a little bit closer. I'm gonna lay the tube on there and then trace it out with a pen or a Sharpie or something. And then once I have a line on there, I can grind both of them clamped together with a bolt through there, so I know they're grinding at the same like pace up until I hit the line. Then I know that it's right where I want it. Alrighty, so I got the shock tabs ground out a little bit, and I'm liking it a lot more. It allows the shock to have a little bit of an angle lane, but nothing too crazy. And that's at full bump, so it should do the same thing at ride height. And so the next step is, obviously the shock is just sitting on the axle right now, so it needs to come up a little bit, and we need to make shock tabs for the bottom. The bottom shock tabs are just going to be these flat mount ones. I had them cut out a lot taller than I needed because I didn't know how these were going to fit front or rear at the time. So I planned to be able to, I wanted to be able to cut them down at any point that I need. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure the distance from the axle tube to the center of the eye on the shock. Then I'm going to add, I don't know, 3/8 of an inch or so to that, just to add some space on the bottom of the shock from the tube. And then we're going to do the, and then we're going to do the same thing on the shock tab. Measure, you know, that same distance onto there, mark it out, make a cut, and then mock it up. And if it looks good, we're going to copy it onto 3 others for the other side, and should be good to go from there. Okay, so I have my lines drawn out. I actually did it a little differently than I said I was going to. I took my spare shock for the other side that's sitting on the ground right there, and I bolted this tab to the bottom of it, and then you can see the line I drew that went around the bottom of the shock. And so I knew right where the bottom of the shock ended when it was bolted on, and then I went like 3/8 of an inch down and drew a line straight across. So that's the line that I'm going to cut at. That's how tall I want my tabs. I'm going to cut this one, go put it on the shock, get an idea of if I want it shorter, or if I mess this one up, you know, I can recut one more. It's not that big of a deal. If I like it, then I'll trace it out onto some of the others, and we'll go from there. All right, so I have that tab on there. and you can start to see what it's starting to look like. The height wise, I'm pretty okay with. I think I might chop it down a little bit. If I scoot over here, you can see I've got quite a bit of room that I can drop that shock down. So I might chop it down a little bit more, get the shock a little lower, which will allow the upper mount to work a little better. The other thing, is I want to cut this corner down a little bit because I'm butted up against the weld on the truss, but I want this in more. I really like the angle of the shock right now, but the bottom of the plate is way too close to the brake. Even though it's clearing right now, it's close enough that, you know, once this was all flexed out, the angle is going to change, right? Because it pivots here, so the angle is going to change and the brake's going to get into it. And I don't know if the tire would as well. So I'm going to grind that down a little bit, we'll cut some, and then we'll grind the corner down, see if we can lower it and scoot it in a little bit more. Because we've got, I mean, a whole fist up to the frame right here. Loads of room to the frame. I might end up grinding these brackets down a little bit more too, but for right now, I'm gonna leave those. They're a lot more of a pain in the butt to clean up and make sure they fit the tube right. So, where this one's just flat, it's nice and easy. So I'm liking this a lot more. You can see I've cut it down a little bit more and I've gave it a little bit of a slope to kind of go up over the edge of the truss there. That allowed me to scoot it forward quite a bit. We've got lots of room around the brake now. Still not as much as I'd like, to be completely honest, but that's what this whole test cycling thing is for, is to make sure it all clears. So as long as it clears, that's what matters. So I'm gonna go ahead and copy that tab onto the other side, get this all tacked on very lightly, get the uppers tacked on as well. You can see the angle that we're working with. It's got a little bit of an angle in still, not as much as I had hoped for, but should be good enough. But anyways, yeah, get this tacked on and then we're gonna cycle it and see if the tire clears. All right, I got the other side made. I got a bolt and nut on there nice and tight. I like the shock angle. I think the clearance is about as good as it's gonna get without losing the clearance to the frame. I like the top tabs. So I'm gonna go ahead and get the welder out, run a couple tacks on each of the tabs, and then we're gonna cycle it. One other thing I should mention is that before I just went and tacked those on, I did trace out that same design on another tab so I know where to cut if I end up liking how those fit. I have another one to cut out to use for the other side. Alright, so I have those tacked on. I'm liking the way it's looking. Looks good. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to throw a tire on that side. I'm going to leave this side off because we don't need that one for right now. I'm going to throw a tire on that side and then I'm going to cycle the suspension and just watch that coilover the whole time because I've already cycled it for the rest. That's why you do the links first, because I know the link's clear now, so I don't have to pay attention to the links anymore. I just got to pay attention to the shock and make sure that it doesn't touch anything throughout its whole cycle from bump to droop to flex, right? You want to make sure that it's all good. So I've got that axle on the ground, so I've got that side of the axle on the ground and this side sitting at almost full bump. I mean, it's basically there. That little bit isn't gonna make a difference. My jack stand just didn't have a setting for that. And you can see what I was talking about. Look at the tight clearance around the brake caliper, but it does clear. So I can take this out and slide up and down. You wanna check mainly for clearance against the frame, clearance against the brakes, and clearance against the tires. So normally speaking, I would always advise you have the tire mounted for this. However, I haven't trimmed my fenders yet, and I didn't really feel like doing that right this very second. But I can tell just looking at this that I'm gonna be okay. So you can kind of visualize the size of the tire compared to, you know, where it's at on the wheel surface and how it's gonna hit the coilover, and I'm pretty sure I'm gonna be okay. I've got it mounted 3 inches further in than I used to have on my old setup, and so that should be plenty. So I'm pretty happy with those. The shock tabs came out good, so I think I'm going to try and replicate it on the other side, get the other shock mounted up, and go from there. We're almost ready to have this thing sitting on its own weight, and then we can burn all these tabs in, because a little sketchy cycling everything with everything just tacked up, but people underestimate the strength of tacks. They're a lot stronger than you think. Okay, so it's the next day. I did a whole bunch of work in the dark without you guys. The camera doesn't pick out stuff in the dark, but as you can see, the Jeep is sitting on its own weight here. So I got the other side mounted up. This side did give me a little bit more trouble. I had to cut the tabs off 2 or 3 times because I was hitting the brake caliper. You know, I would just cut them off because we're just tacking them. I'd cut them off and move them in a little bit, tack it on, cycle everything, make sure it looked good, and then I would step really far back, you know, and just eyeball the angle of the shocks. I wanted to make sure that they looked the same on both sides. Then once I had it all cycling good, fitting good, I had both the tabs burned in. I went ahead and burned in the link mounts. They're not fully burned in, but enough that I was comfortable with putting it on its own weight. Then I went ahead and mounted the tires and wheels, and got the Jeep sitting on its own weight. You can see how far back it's sitting. I need to trim the fenders a little bit. So that's super exciting. That's a huge milestone. A couple of things to note. This is sitting a lot higher than I want it to, and the main reason for that is because the coilovers are unloading. And what I mean by that is the front end, if you can see, the front end is pushing down because there's no weight, right? There's nothing for the front end to push to the ground. So the rear is unloading, and it's sitting a lot higher than it should be. And so you can't really calculate your spring rates yet until you have the front end on the ground as well. So you really need to, A, not be concerned about how it looks yet, and B, you need to finish the whole thing, get it sitting on its own weight, front and rear, and then we can come back and we can calculate the proper spring rate that we want. And in order to do that, you really only need one coil. It doesn't matter what size it is. It matters what diameter it is, but it doesn't matter how long it is. It doesn't matter what the spring rate is. You just need a coil that fits on the coilover for each side. So go to a buddy who has some, or just take a wild guess and buy some. They're only like $80 to $100. But if you can have a coil, then you can calculate the spring rate for whatever ride height you want. So say I wanted 3 inches of shaft or 4 inches of shaft showing. You know, you can calculate how much shaft you want to show based on how much whatever coil you have laying around compresses. Based on how much it compresses, because you know the spring rate, you can calculate how heavy the load is on that coilover, right? Some people call it corner weight, but it's how heavy the load is. Then you can calculate what spring rate you need in order to achieve the ride height that you want. And so that's pretty much the next step for the rear of this thing, but I can't do that again until I get the front end done. So I guess I'm gonna leave you guys here, and we'll come back to that when I have the front done. That may be a week from now, maybe 2 weeks from now, I'm not sure, but we'll come back to that, and I will show you guys how to properly calculate the spring rates.